The Recipe Book, The Path to Self-Mastery, a short story by Condit. Chapter 1, The Recipe Book. The bell above the shop door jingled softly as Maya stepped inside, a sound that seemed to open not just a door, but another world. She stood for a moment, taking in the scent of aged parchment, dried herbs, and something intangible like possibility. The shop was cluttered with shelves stacked high with strange wares, copper kettles, wooden spoons carved with ancient symbols, jars filled with spices that shimmered as if they held captive sunlight. Maya wasn't sure why she'd come in. Cooking had always been a frustration for her, a battlefield of burnt pans and clumpy sauces. But something had nudged her, a whisper she couldn't place, urging her to take a step beyond her usual path. "You look lost," came a deep, gravelly voice. Startled, Maya turned to see a tall man behind the counter. His beard was streaked with silver, and his eyes held the warmth of a hearth fire. He looked at her with a mix of curiosity and certainty, as if he knew her better than she knew herself. Lost I was just," her words faltered. What was she doing here? "You'll find what you need," he said, his voice steady and calm. He gestured towards a high shelf where a single book rested. Its cover was plain leather, but golden threads spiraled along its spine in intricate patterns that seemed to move when she wasn't looking directly at them. Maya's hand moved instinctively to point. "That book. What is it?" The shopkeeper smiled, the kind of smile that seemed to know more than it was saying. "The Recipe Book. Some say it holds the key to becoming a chef, if that's what you're after. Others find it to be more of a mirror." "A mirror?" she echoed. "Take it," he said, lifting the book from the shelf and handing it to her. "But remember, it's not the book that makes the chef." At home, Maya opened the recipe book with trembling hands. Inside were pages filled with ornate handwriting, each line detailing recipes far beyond anything she'd attempted before. She skimmed a recipe for a dish called Phoenix Souffle, its steps precise and unyielding. Another, ethereal broth, demanded ingredients she couldn't pronounce. Each dish seemed to hum with its own life, as though daring her to try. "This is it," she whispered. "If I can master these recipes, I'll finally be good enough." For weeks Maya became a servant to the book. She measured and chopped with precision, her heart pounding as she tried to replicate its demands. But her soufflé sank, her sauces separated, and even her simplest attempts felt hollow, lifeless. Each failure weighed on her until the joy she imagined in cooking was replaced by frustration and doubt. One evening, after a particularly disastrous attempt at celestial tart, Maya threw the book across the kitchen. "What's the point?" she cried. "I'll never be good enough." The book lay open, its pages fluttering as though responding to her despair. But Maya didn't notice. Exhausted, she sank to the floor, her hands streaked with flour, and her heart heavy with doubt. Chapter 2, The First Ingredient. The next morning, Maya woke with a sense of resignation. She stared at the recipe book now perched on her counter. It no longer felt like a guide, it felt like a judge. Her stomach growled, and she shuffled to the pantry. Most of her shelves were empty, save for a few basics: onions, garlic, carrots, and a lonely jar of cumin. Her mind whispered, "This isn't enough. You can't make anything worthwhile with this." But a quieter voice, so soft she almost missed it, asked, "Why not?" She grabbed the onions and garlic and began to chop, the knife unsteady in her hands. She heated a pot and tossed the pieces in, their sizzling meeting her ears like a small applause. Next came the carrots, their orange slices falling into the pot like sunbeams. She glanced at the cumin jar hesitantly. "Just a pinch," she murmured, sprinkling it in. The aroma transformed instantly, filling the air with something warm and inviting. She added water and let the pot simmer, tasting it as it cooked. Too bland, a dash of salt. Too sharp, a squeeze of lemon. When she finally ladled the soup into a bowl, she stared at it for a moment, unsure. Then she took a sip. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers. Warm, simple, and alive with flavor. For the first time, Maya felt a flicker of pride. Maybe I don't need a perfect recipe, she thought. Maybe I just need to start. That evening, a knock at the door startled her. When she opened it, she found an old man standing on her stoop, holding a basket of steaming bread. His apron was stained with flour, and his eyes twinkled with mischief. "You're the one with the burnt soufflés, aren't you?" he said without preamble. Maya blinked. How did you know?" "I smelled them," he said, stepping inside, uninvited but strangely welcome. "Or rather, I smelt your frustration. Burnt dreams have a particular scent." "Who are you?" she asked, bewildered. "Call me what you like," he said, setting the bread on her counter. "Some know me as the wandering baker. I couldn't help noticing you're trying very hard to become, what, a chef?" "Yes," she said, embarrassed, "but I'm not very good at it." He tore off a piece of bread and popped it into his mouth. "Ah, yes, you think you need a title before you can create something worthwhile." "Well, don't I?" she asked defensively. "Isn't that what chefs do?" The baker laughed, a sound that filled the room with warmth. "Chefs are just cooks who forgot how to play. Tell me, when you taste something, do you know if it's sweet or bitter, salty or sour?" "Of course," she said, frowning. "Then you already have everything you need," he said. "Taste, instinct, and curiosity. The rest is just practice." As the baker left, Maya returned to the kitchen, his words echoing in her mind. She opened the recipe book again, but this time she didn't feel its weight. She skimmed a recipe for golden harvest soup, then closed the book and turned to her pantry. Onions, garlic, carrots, and a pinch of cumin. She would begin again, not with a book, but with herself. Chapter 3, The Burnt Soufflé. The next morning, Maya woke with renewed determination. She flipped through the recipe book and found a recipe for heaven's soufflé, its instructions pristine and exacting. She stared at it for a long time, her fingers brushing the page. A voice whispered in her mind, "You're not ready for this. Stick to the soup." But a deeper voice, one she couldn't ignore, said, "Yeah, you never know unless you try." She gathered the ingredients, each one precious and intimidating. Eggs were cracked with trembling hands, whites separated with painstaking care. She whisked, folded, and poured, her focus razor sharp. By the time the batter went into the oven, her kitchen looked like a war zone, but she felt triumphant. The soufflé began to rise, golden and glorious. Maya crouched by the oven door, her face alight with hope. But as the timer dinged, her heart plummeted. The soufflé deflated before her eyes, collapsing into a soggy, burnt mess. Tears blurred her vision as she pulled it out of the oven. She stared at the ruined dish, feeling as though it mocked her efforts. "I'll never be good enough," she whispered, sinking to the floor. A familiar knock pulled her from her despair. The wandering baker entered carrying a basket of freshly picked herbs. He glanced at the soufflé, then at her tear-streaked face. "A masterpiece," he declared, his grin infuriatingly wide. "Are you blind?" she snapped. "It's a disaster." "Hardly," he said, plucking up a piece of burnt edge. He popped it into his mouth and chewed thoughtfully. "A bit overdone, yes, but the flavor? It's all there." Maya frowned, tentatively tasting it herself. He was right. The cheese and herbs danced on her tongue, their potential shining through the charred exterior. "Every mistake," he said gently, "is just another ingredient. Use what you've learned, adjust, and try again." For the first time, Maya didn't feel defeated. She felt curious. Chapter 4, The Pantry of Possibilities. Days later, a note arrived at Maya's door. Follow the crumbs. She followed the trail to a part of town she'd never explored, where a door painted deep green beckoned her. Pushing it open, she found herself in a room unlike any she'd ever seen. The air shimmered with possibility, and the walls were lined with shelves overflowing with jars, baskets, and bins. Ingredients glowed, whispered, and pulsed with energy. Behind the counter stood a wizened woman, her eyes twinkling with amusement. "Welcome to the Pantry of Possibility," she said. "You must be Maya." "How do you know my name?" Maya asked, but the woman simply smiled. The woman gestured towards the shelves. "Every ingredient here has a story. The question is, what will you create?" Maya wandered through the pantry, her fingers brushing jars of glowing powders, humming seeds, liquids that were shimmering like molten gold. She picked up a jar of paprika and held it up. "Ah, paprika," the woman said. "Fiery and bold. But what will it mean to you?" Maya hesitated and then placed it in her basket. One by one, she selected items without fully understanding why. By the time she returned home, her bag was filled with mysteries. That evening, she experimented. She let the ingredients guide her, trusting her instincts instead of following a recipe. The paprika turned a simple stew into a vibrant masterpiece, its warmth wrapping around her like a comforting embrace. For the first time, cooking felt less like work and more like a conversation, a dialogue between her and the ingredients. Chapter 5, The Feast Within. Maya's confidence grew with each dish she created. She began to see cooking not as a skill to master, but as an expression of herself. One day she decided to host a dinner for her friends. She wanted to share her newly found joy. The table was simple but inviting, adorned with mismatched plates and candles she'd found at the market. She served her soup, her paprika stew, and even a lavender honey bread she'd improvised that morning. As her friends ate, their faces lit up with delight. "This is amazing," one friend said. "You're such a natural. Where did you learn all this?" Maya hesitated. The truth was she hadn't learned it, at least not in the way they imagined. "I just listened," she said, "to the ingredients, to myself." Her friends didn't care about her lack of titles or formal training. They didn't ask her if her dishes came from recipes or imagination. They simply enjoyed her food, and in that moment, Maya realized something profound. The joy of creation didn't come from perfection. It came from authenticity. Chapter 6, The Recipe Unwritten. That night, as Maya cleaned up, she felt a strange pull. She sat in her quiet kitchen, closed her eyes, and took a deep breath. For the first time, she turned her attention inward, seeking the voice that had guided her all along. She found herself standing in a vast ethereal kitchen. The countertops were carved from crystal, and the air shimmered with a golden light. Around her, figures began to appear, soft, glowing forms that felt like old friends. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling. One figure stepped forward, its light warm and familiar. "We are your guides," it said, "and you have always known us." Tears filled her eyes. "I've been so lost, I thought I needed someone to tell me what to do, how to be." "You have never been lost," the figure said gently. "You've been searching outside for what has always been within." The figure held out its hands and a glowing recipe book appeared. When Maya opened it, she saw page after page of blank parchment. "I don't understand," she said. "You are the author of your own recipes," the guide said. You don't need someone else's instructions to create beauty. You only need to trust yourself. When Maya opened her eyes, she felt a deep peace. She walked to the recipe book on her counter, flipping through its pages until she reached the last one. For the first time, she saw it as it truly was. Not an instruction manual, but a tool for inspiration. With a steady hand, she picked up a pen and began to write. There are no rules, only taste, instinct, and curiosity. From that day forward, Maya cooked without fear. She experimented, explored, and trusted her inner voice. She understood that cooking and life wasn't about someone else's path. It was about creating her own. Every dish she made was a masterpiece, not because it was perfect, but because it was hers.